You're moving into the small storage room with your mother-in-law.
That's what my husband, who had been living with me and my mother in my childhood home, suddenly declared after the renovation was finished. My husband, overwhelmed with frustration, suddenly lashed out. He announced that he was kicking my mother and me out and would be living in our newly renovated home with his own mother instead. My childhood home was filled with memories of my late father, and I was trembling with anger as it was being taken over. My name is Rachel Adams, and I'm 33 years old. I've been married to my husband, Chris, for 8 years. We both work and decided to live with my mother in my childhood home because it was close to our workplaces. In other words, he's a live-in son-in-law. My dad had passed away before I got married. I had hesitated to leave my mother alone, but Chris reassured me, saying, "If you're worried about leaving your mom alone, let's all live together." Though my father's old house had become pretty worn down, it was filled with precious memories for me and my mother, so I was really happy when Chris agreed to live there with us. Chris is the youngest of 3 siblings, and his mother, Jane, had shown a particular favoritism for her eldest son. There was often a stark difference between how the eldest son and the rest were treated. Chris would often complain about it. Being the youngest and not as tied down, Chris had no problem moving into my childhood home. Hearing his story convinced me to take the plunge and marry him. But there was one person who opposed Chris moving into my family home. His mother, Jane. She might have felt like her son was being taken away. Chris's older brother was already living with their parents, so it wouldn't have been practical for Chris to live there too. I wanted to save up for our own place, so I convinced Jane that it made the most sense for us to live rent-free in my mother's home. I'd heard that Jane had always favored her eldest son, but around this time, she suddenly became much more attentive to Chris. I hadn't expected Chris leaving his childhood home to cause so much drama, but because of that, my relationship with Jane remained strained even after our marriage. Lately, Chris has been paying a lot more attention to Jane. Maybe it's because Jane suddenly started doting on Chris after our marriage was arranged. Perhaps he enjoyed all the attention because he began prioritizing his mother over everything else. Worse, if I didn't think of her first, he'd fly into a rage. I've never treated Jane poorly and have always been polite and respectful toward her. But to Chris, it seemed like I was neglecting his mom in favor of mine. Naturally, he'd never talk about this in front of my mother. But when we were alone, he'd constantly complain. Because he insisted I be more attentive to Jane, I started visiting her more often. I always brought her favorite snacks and called ahead to let her know I was coming, but she was often not home. I felt she was avoiding me, but if I didn't visit, she'd gripe to Chris that I never showed up or didn't even bring her a gift. Every time, Chris' brother's wife, who often seemed apologetic, would take my gifts and pass them on to Jane. She confided in me that Jane also nagged her constantly, and we'd often bond over how challenging our situation was. She and I were the same age and had become good friends. Initially, I'd assumed Jane's attitude would soften over time, but that was a huge mistake. Even after 8 years of marriage, nothing changed. In those 8 years, a lot has happened. My father-in-law passed away, and the eldest son's family had twins. Many things changed within the family. Particularly in Chris' parents' home, which was now bustling. The eldest son's family is quite large, and with the recent addition of the twins, they now have 5 children. And all of them were boys. Jane was overwhelmed and asked Chris if she could stay with us for a while. In truth, Chris' brother had asked her to help with the chores, but Jane didn't want to do it and just wanted a break at our house. Our home had extra rooms, but the place was old. I suggested to Chris that if Jane was going to stay with us temporarily, we should renovate the house. He seemed surprised by my response since he thought I was against his mother moving in. Although I wasn't thrilled about the idea, I wanted to help his sister-in-law as much as possible. Chris worked for a construction company, and renovations were his specialty. I can trust my husband to handle everything perfectly. You're the expert, so I'll leave it to you, I said as we decided to remodel our house. Since my mom is getting older, this was the perfect opportunity to make our home more accessible by eliminating steps and adding handrails. During construction, my mom and I stayed at my sister's house, while my husband moved to a weekly rental apartment with his mother, but on the day the renovation was completed, the incident happened. Until then, I believed the house had been transformed into a comfortable home. My husband showed me around the house. There were no steps, handrails were installed everywhere, and thoughtful features were included so that we could live here comfortably as we age. My husband had sneakily created a hobby room for himself, but I decided to let that slide. After all, he was the driving force behind the renovation, so I figured it was fine. As he continued to show me around, I suddenly noticed something alarming. There was no room for me or my mom. The room my mom used to have was now his mother's room. Where is my mom's room? You haven't shown me yet. I could find another place to stay, but not having a room for my mom was absurd.
I already showed you earlier.
He said with a smug smile. He says he already showed me, but he hasn't, which is why I'm asking. I had a bad feeling about this. What? You haven't shown me.
You and your mom will be in that small storage room.
I couldn't believe what I was hearing from him. Yes, he had shown me that small storage room earlier. This is the darkest spot in the entire house. It's a dim storage room with just one small window, barely letting any light in. You've got to be kidding me. Stop with the nonsense. I snapped at my husband, but his mother quickly stepped in between us.
You've been his wife for 8 years, and still haven't learned how to be one. You don't argue with your husband. That makes you a failure. Chris rebuilt this house so beautifully for you. If you don't like that room, then get a divorce and leave.
When his mother suddenly hinted at the word divorce, I lost my patience and felt my blood boil. Chris was grinning like he thought I would never divorce him. In that moment, all my feelings of love from the past 8 years vanished. Oh, so this was your plan from the start?
If you don't like that storage room, why not put your mom in a care home instead? There's no room anyway. With 2 mothers under one roof. It's tough for you, isn't it?
I glared at my husband, who had the nerve to say something like that. I recalled what Chris' brother's wife had mentioned. Since the renovation was decided, Chris and his mother had been whispering to each other constantly, always planning something together. Unable to contain his joy, Chris was like a child as he fawned over his mom in front of his brother and their kids. He had been looking forward to living with his beloved mother in a new home, and she, too, was eagerly anticipating a quiet environment. Seeing the two of them giggling together made me feel sick, so I took my stunned mother by the arm and left with heavy footsteps through the front door. I walked loudly, hoping to leave marks on the floor. My mom, in shock, stumbled out with me. From behind, I could hear the triumphant laughter of Chris and his mother. I couldn't forgive his betrayal after 8 years of marriage. Revenge was all I could think about. We ran back to my sister's house, and when we arrived, we just collapsed. There was so much to take in that we couldn't even find the words. My mom was still in a daze.
Do you think we got our home stolen?
She said, taking a sip of the tea my sister offered her. Her words made my chest ache. This is what happens when I go along with my husband's idea of remodeling and leave everything up to him.
We have to get the house back. It's filled with so many memories. Your father built it.
My mom murmured as I held her hand tightly. That approach won't satisfy me. That's not going to work. We need to go all out, I said, and my mom, who had been looking down, raised her head.
What will we do?
I have a plan. I shared my idea with her. And though she was initially surprised, she nodded quietly.
If it's your plan, Rachel, I won't oppose it.
She said, and with that, our counterattack against my husband and his mother began. A few days later, we went near my mom's old house and saw a moving truck parked outside. We could see my mother-in-law carrying her things inside from a distance. Judging by the amount of luggage, it was clear she intended to live here permanently rather than temporarily. Without lifting a finger, my mother-in-law was directing my husband on how to move her things. He was happily helping with the unloading. Seeing the joy on his face made me even angrier at the two of them. After checking on my mom's old home, we visited the lawyer who had been helping us, joined by a realtor. This was the only way to fight back against my husband's betrayal. I told the lawyer about the remodel and how my husband and his mother had effectively taken over our home, then asked for advice on what to do next. Though he initially seemed surprised by my story, he shared our anger upon learning how poorly my husband had behaved. With his and the realtor's help, we crafted a comprehensive plan. A week after my husband and his mother took over the house, I returned. When I rang the doorbell, his mother appeared, saying cheerfully, "Coming."
Who is oh, it's you.
She scowled as soon as she recognized me. I have something important to discuss, so I'm coming in. And I'm sorry, but your attitude makes you seem like you own this house when you don't. I almost forgot this place was mine, I said, dripping with sarcasm as I marched into the house. The remodeled home, filled with new furniture and appliances, was no longer the house I'd grown up in. It felt like all my childhood memories had been erased. In the back living room, my husband was lounging around. He scowled at me, just like his mother, saying, "What the hell are you doing barging into someone else's house?" "Honey, it's been a while. I'm here because I have something important to discuss." I sat across the table from him, with the lawyer beside me.
What's this about? Are you finally moving into the small room? I guess you're bringing a single mover for that, since you won't have much room for your stuff.
His mocking tone made me want to snap, but I promised myself to stay calm today. After all, this would be a guaranteed victory for me. So there was no need to rush. Before we get to conclusions, I need to ask you something. I want to understand why he had remodeled my mom's house this way and forced us out. I thought we'd lived as a happily married couple without any major conflicts since we got married. His relationship with my mom should have been good, too. His sudden change in attitude baffled me. Even if Jane pushed him into it, what he did was still way too bold. In response to my question, my husband let out a big sigh, clearly annoyed. Then he gave me another condescending smile.
I got sick of it all. Playing the son-in-law and catering to you and your mom. I've been holding back for so long. I just want to live with my mom and no one else.
His half-angry response left me stunned. The realization that he was just a mama's boy was so ridiculous that I couldn't even find the words. When I stood there speechless, my husband began to vent everything he had been holding back. He complained about not being able to live with his mother and how it was embarrassing for him, as a man, to live in his wife's home. It felt like fraud, given that this was the complete opposite of what he had always said. He quietly put up with it and then lost his temper, making me suspect he was a psychopath for scheming to take over my parents' home. If you were so dissatisfied, why didn't you just say something?
There's no way I could say I was unhappy. I'm a man. You should have known.
Even his final argument was ridiculously childish. Jane was on the verge of tears listening to his outburst. I believed it was the result of her favoring her eldest son so much, but she didn't seem to think that was the case. She simply pitied her son who adored her. Watching this pathetic family drama play out, I couldn't take the ridiculousness anymore and let out a big sigh. My husband noticed my attitude and raised his voice.
What's with that attitude? You should be grateful I even provided you with a small room. I could have easily taken away your space, too.
His face was bright red as he spoke, like a kid throwing a tantrum.
Oh, yes, what a kind boy to let such a lousy wife keep her room.
Thanks, Mom. I'm so happy you're proud of me.
To end this farce quickly, I put divorce papers in front of my husband. I had already signed them. Please, just divorce me. I don't want to stay married to you after all this. I then showed the property registration documents, explaining that this house was one of the assets I inherited from my father and that it was in my name. My husband's face went pale as he realized what was going on.
I won't divorce you. I was the one who renovated the place. Even if the deed is in your name, it's still ours. I won't let you divorce me.
It seemed he realized divorce would mean getting kicked out of the house. But why did he think he could stay here by refusing to divorce? This house is in my name. It's my property. And I've already sold it. I then laid out another document in front of him, the sales contract for the property and house. Both my husband and Jane leaned in, checking the name and date. This house is already sold, so you both need to vacate soon. I expect the new buyer will want to move in, so you need to leave today or tomorrow. I told them this with a big smile, and their faces turned pale. Whether we divorce or not, you won't be living here. I don't want to see your face anymore, so please divorce me.
What? How come? Wasn't this your house?
Jane had mistakenly believed the house belonged to her son.
Well,
They probably didn't think I'd go this far. They must have expected me to offer some kind of compromise and forgive them. But I wasn't that naive, and I'd long lost any affection for my husband. I didn't have a shred of mercy left. For further details, speak with my attorney. Don't talk to me directly.
if we get kicked out of this house, where are we supposed to go?
Exactly. I thought we'd finally found a quiet place to spend the rest of my days with a housekeeper.
Jane saw me and my mother as housekeepers rather than family. I knew nothing good would come of speaking with them further. You can move back to your son's house and live with his brother and his wife. But you might not be welcome, given you angered him by saying you were glad to leave that noisy place. With those parting words, I quickly left my family home. It was a place full of memories. And I hesitated about the sale. But there was no way I'd let myself be humiliated to this extent. In fact, the house had changed so much that the memories were barely recognizable. I know my decision was the right one. 3 days later, my husband and Jane left in a hurry. I didn't want to keep the house that had been renovated so carelessly, so I knocked it down and sold the vacant land. Looking at the now empty lot, I felt both sad and refreshed, leaving me with mixed emotions. After that, my husband and Jane went back to their family home for a while and lived with his brother and his wife, even though they were treated like intruders. My husband was reluctant to divorce, but when I left all negotiations to the lawyer, he seemed to realize I had lost all feelings for him. According to the lawyer, he finally signed the divorce papers while crying his eyes out. In the end, my husband felt completely helpless when Jane started sucking up to his brother instead of him. He thought he'd finally become her favorite son, but it didn't last long. This situation led to Jane being completely cut off from his brother and his wife. My husband and Jane rented a small apartment near his work and began living alone. Having never lived by himself before, my husband found it tough, and Jane kept nagging him about his low income while doing all the housework herself. Every week, my husband reaches out to me, asking to get back together because life with Jane is too difficult, but I ignore it all. After everything that happened, it's ridiculous that he still thinks we can reconcile. I'm not planning on remarrying, and I built a small new home on a little piece of land my father left behind, where my mother and I live. The house is just a small, single-story home for the two of us, but we filled it with all our favorite things. I'm still working, so there's nothing to worry about financially. My mother, who was initially shocked when the old house was gone, is slowly coming back to her old, cheerful self. Even though she's not technically family anymore, my ex's brother's wife still brings the kids to visit the new house. She continues to treat us the same way after the divorce, and I'm really grateful for that. My new life with my mother has just begun. We laughed together, promising to enjoy every moment of what's ahead.